A single touch that changed everything, an unforgettable dinner table secret. Have you ever experienced a moment so fleeting, so seemingly insignificant, yet it had the power to unravel everything you thought you knew? Life has a way of throwing unexpected twists at us. And sometimes, a simple brush of the leg under the dinner table can set off a chain reaction that changes everything. This is a story of forbidden feelings, unraveling relationships, and the haunting realization that some moments, no matter how brief, can alter your life forever. Before diving into this emotional roller coaster, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like this video. Your support motivates us to bring you more captivating stories. And now, sit back, relax, and let's dive into the story. It started on an unremarkable Tuesday night. The kind of evening that barely registers in memory because of how ordinary it seems. There were no omens, no cosmic signs to hint at the shift that was about to happen. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, steamed vegetables, and a bottle of red wine that Thomas had opened with his usual efficiency but barely touched. Thomas had a habit of being elsewhere, physically present but mentally adrift, lost in the endless currents of his thoughts, his phone, or his work. It was a pattern I had grown used to, though not without a quiet ache of loneliness. Sharing a meal with him often felt like dining alongside a shadow of the man I had once been drawn to. The person who had once captivated me with his vision and drive now seemed consumed by deadlines and to-do lists, his focus perpetually elsewhere. And then there was Stephen, though we had taken to calling him Tyler, his middle name. At 26, Tyler was a puzzle still being pieced together. The edges jagged from a recent failure. His startup, full of promise and ambition, had collapsed after just a year, leaving him grappling with disappointment and uncertainty. Thomas, ever the fixer, had offered him refuge in our home, a place to reset, rebuild, and regain his footing. It was a noble gesture, one that spoke to Thomas's unfailing belief in second chances. But to me, it felt like we were inviting a storm into our lives. A storm fueled by unspoken expectations and unhealed wounds. The dinner table was a fragile stage that night, its players caught in the subtle dance of tension and routine. Tyler sat across from me, his expression unreadable, his presence both a comfort and a weight I couldn't quite define. The accident, a moment so small it should have been insignificant, happened halfway through the meal. My foot shifted beneath the table, brushing against his leg. The touch was brief, fleeting, and yet it carried a charge that caught me off guard. It wasn't the touch itself but the way Tyler looked at me afterward that unsettled me. His gaze was penetrating, not merely curious but searching, as though he had seen something I hadn't meant to reveal. For a heartbeat, I was frozen, caught in a moment I couldn't explain but felt deeply. Was it just my imagination? A coincidence? A trick of the mind? I wanted to dismiss it, to write it off as nothing. But the look in his eyes lingered, a spark of something unspoken but undeniable. The rest of the evening unfolded in a haze of normalcy, the kind that masks the undercurrents of change. Dishes were cleared, conversations faded, and the house settled into its familiar rhythm of quiet. Yet, that single touch haunted me, replaying in my mind like a scene from a movie I couldn't escape. It was as if a door had been left ajar, letting in a breeze that carried questions I wasn't ready to answer. This is the story of how a seemingly inconsequential moment unraveled the threads of my carefully constructed life, exposing truths I had long buried. It's strange how life can hold so much contradiction, fullness and emptiness. Joy and sorrow. Certainty and doubt, all at once. My marriage to Thomas was much the same. A paradox of stability and distance. He was everything a partner should be by conventional standards: successful, dependable, the kind of man people admired. But behind that facade of perfection was a void. A chasm that no amount of time together could bridge. When I met Thomas 15 years ago, he was magnetic. A man who commanded attention without trying. It was at a design expo where he was presenting one of his firm's latest projects. I was there on a freelance assignment, covering trends in modern architecture. Thomas stood out, not just for his work but for the way he spoke about it. With a passion that seemed to light up the room. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had found someone who saw the world as I did, full of possibilities. Alive with potential. I thought Thomas and I were building something extraordinary. A partnership rooted in shared ambition and mutual respect. But as the years went by, his world began to shrink. Consumed by the relentless demands of his career. Deadlines, clients, and blueprints became his life. And I became a bystander, a silent observer in a narrative where I no longer had a starring role. Slowly, imperceptibly, I began to lose pieces of myself, fading into the background of his story. And then came Tyler. And with him, a spark of something I hadn't felt in years, something that frightened me as much as it intrigued me. Looking back, I realized that moment under the table was more than just a fleeting touch. It was the first crack in the foundation of a life I thought was unshakable. The beginning of a journey I couldn't have predicted but could no longer ignore. When Thomas's son, Tyler, moved back into our home, it felt like the delicate balance we had been carefully maintaining for years had been upended. Tyler, at 27, carried the visible and invisible weight of a failed dream, a tech startup that had burned brightly for less than a year before fizzling out. The startup had been more than just a venture, it had been his identity, his aspiration, and, for Thomas, an investment of both money and belief. Now, Tyler moved through life like a ship with a broken mast, drifting aimlessly. And our home bore the brunt of his aimlessness. I never knew all the details of what had gone wrong with the business. I didn't ask. And Tyler didn't volunteer. What I did know was enough: it had shattered him in ways he wouldn't admit. And though Thomas remained steadfastly supportive, I could sense his disappointment lingering just beneath the surface. Like a cloud that never quite dissipated. Give him time, Thomas told me one evening as we sat in the dimly lit living room. His voice carried the same quiet determination he always used when trying to will something into existence. He's figuring things out. Time will fix everything. The words rankled me in a way I couldn't explain. Before I could stop myself, I snapped back. Time doesn't fix everything. Thomas turned to me, his expression softening but his brow furrowed in that familiar way that signaled both concern and frustration. He's my son, Elise. He needs our support. I nodded, biting back the sharp retort that danced on the tip of my tongue. Thomas was right. Of course. But that didn't make it easier. Tyler wasn't an easy presence to have around. He spent most of his days secluded in his room, emerging only to grab a meal or nurse a beer while staring blankly at the television. Our interactions were polite but strained, like two acquaintances navigating an awkward dinner party. Still, I tried. I left fresh towels on his bed, cooked the meals I remembered him loving as a child, and even ventured a few casual conversations about the books he was reading or the music he listened to. But every effort felt like tossing pebbles into an abyss, met with silence or a curt acknowledgement that felt more like dismissal. Tyler wasn't outright unkind, he was distant. Walled off. And I couldn't help but wonder if he even noticed my attempts to bridge the growing gap between us. Yet, there were fleeting moments that hinted at the person he used to be. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear him at the piano, his fingers weaving melodies that seemed to breathe life into the stillness of the house. The music was hauntingly beautiful, overflowing with an emotion that felt too raw, too intimate, for someone who seemed so disconnected during the day. In those moments, I caught a glimpse of the Tyler I imagined Thomas was waiting for, the version of his son who wasn't weighed down by failure or doubt. And in those moments, I felt something stir in me too. A quiet longing, perhaps, or a fragile hope that he might find his way back. Then came the night when everything shifted, though at the time, it seemed as ordinary as any other. Thomas had called to say he'd be working late, leaving me to prepare dinner alone. It was nothing fancy: roast chicken, steamed vegetables, and a bottle of red wine Thomas liked to open but rarely finished. The kitchen was warm and fragrant, the kind of atmosphere that should have felt comforting but instead felt like a stage set for something I couldn't quite name. Tyler came downstairs just as I was placing the last dish on the table. His hair was disheveled, his eyes tired, and his steps tentative, as if he wasn't sure he belonged in the space. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the silence stretching out like a taut string. And then he broke it. "Smells good," he said, his voice low and almost hesitant, as if testing the waters. "Thanks," I replied, offering him a faint smile. The words were mundane, but the air between us felt charged, as though something had shifted imperceptibly. There was a weight to the moment, a subtle tension that neither of us acknowledged but both seemed to feel. Thomas arrived not long after, his footsteps echoing through the entryway. He loosened his tie as he walked in, brushing a quick kiss against my cheek before heading toward the kitchen to wash up. It was a gesture that should have been reassuring, a familiar routine we had performed countless times. But tonight it felt different. There was an undercurrent of strain in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that the dynamics of our family, and perhaps our lives, were quietly unraveling. As we sat down to dinner, the conversation was sparse and halting, punctuated by the clinking of silverware and the occasional half-hearted comment about work or the news. Yet, beneath the surface, I could feel the fault lines deepening, the fragile threads holding us together fraying ever so slightly. It was as if we were all waiting for something, though none of us could say what it was or when it might come. We sat down at the table together, a rare occurrence in these busy days when schedules rarely aligned and silence often replaced the laughter that used to fill our evenings. The soft glow of the overhead light cast long shadows on the wooden surface, highlighting the untouched bowls of food that awaited us. For a moment, it felt like we were trying to reclaim something we had lost. But the quiet made the attempt feel hollow. The clinking of cutlery against ceramic plates punctuated the stillness, the rhythm steady yet distant. Occasionally, Thomas's phone would buzz softly against the table, breaking the monotony as he glanced at it between bites. Scrolling through his endless stream of messages, he was absorbed, barely present, though physically right there. I tried to focus on the meal, the simple act of eating. But my thoughts wandered. The day's small stresses, the errands left undone, the unanswered emails, played on a loop in my mind, distracting me. As I shifted in my seat, stretching my legs beneath the table in an attempt to ease the tension in my body. My foot brushed against something warm. The contact startled me. My breath hitched as I froze, realizing, a fraction too late, that it was Tyler's leg. A jolt of awareness coursed through me, my pulse quickening as if my body had reacted before my mind could comprehend. The sensation lingered, searing in its simplicity yet profound in its effect. Flustered, I pulled my foot back abruptly, as though it had touched something forbidden. "Sorry," I murmured, the words barely audible, my voice faltering under the weight of the moment. My cheeks burned, a heat rising unbidden and unwelcome. "It's fine," Tyler replied quickly, his tone calm, almost dismissive. But his eyes, those unguarded, expressive eyes, betrayed him. They flicked up to meet mine, just for an instant. And in that fleeting connection, I felt something shift. A subtle but undeniable current passed between us, invisible yet heavy with meaning. The moment was so brief it could have been missed, but its impact lingered like the faint echo of a thunderclap. Tyler's gaze dropped back to his plate, and the spell was broken, leaving the air around us charged and unsteady. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. Yet every cell in my body told me otherwise. For the rest of the meal, I couldn't stop noticing him. The way he adjusted in his seat, the light tapping of his fingers against the table, the quick glances he stole when he thought I wasn't looking, it all felt magnified, amplified, as though the room had shrunk, pulling him closer into my orbit. My focus splintered, every word of the conversation blurred into background noise. Even the act of lifting my fork felt deliberate, as though I had to concentrate to appear unaffected. Thomas, oblivious to the undercurrent running between Tyler and me, excused himself after dinner to retreat to his office. It was his routine, always a flurry of papers and emails that demanded his attention long after the day had ended. I stayed behind to clear the table, welcoming the distraction of stacking plates and tidying up. But Tyler lingered. He leaned casually against the counter, his posture relaxed, though there was a tension in his gaze that betrayed him. He watched me as I moved around the kitchen, his presence almost tangible. "Dinner was good," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual, carrying a softness that felt uncharacteristic. "Thanks," I replied, not daring to look at him, my hands busy rearranging dishes in the dishwasher. I tried to focus on the task, hoping to ground myself in its simplicity. A silence stretched between us, thick, weighted, and unspoken. I could feel his eyes on me, and the awareness of him standing so close sent a shiver down my spine. When I finally turned, our eyes met, and in that brief connection, I saw something flicker in his expression. It was there and gone in an instant, yet it left me breathless. I couldn't name it, couldn't quite place the emotion, but its intensity was undeniable. Tyler looked away, clearing his throat, as though breaking the moment deliberately. "Good night," he said, his voice now more distant, guarded. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and disappeared up the stairs, leaving me standing there, frozen and unsure. The silence that followed felt oppressive, pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I finished cleaning up mechanically, my mind replaying the fleeting moments from dinner, the accidental brush of our legs, the charged glances, the inexplicable tension. They were such small, insignificant things. And yet, they weren't. Not to me. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside Thomas, the scene played over and over in my mind like a film reel I couldn't stop. My heart raced at the memory of Tyler's gaze, the awareness in his eyes, and the way it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and completely bewildering. In the days that followed, our interactions became a strange dance. We moved around each other carefully, both avoiding and seeking those fleeting moments of connection. Every glance, every word exchanged carried a weight I couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. It was as though an invisible thread now tied us together, fragile, tenuous, but impossible to sever. I found myself noticing everything about him: the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, the faint trace of his cologne that lingered long after he had passed, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. These small details became monumental, filling my mind in ways I couldn't control. And though I told myself I was imagining it, that it was nothing more than a harmless awareness, deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't nothing. It was everything. Thomas, utterly unaware of the simmering undercurrents that had begun to seep into the corners of our home, immersed himself in his work with relentless dedication. His days started early, the sun barely rising before he was out the door. And by the time he returned, the house was cloaked in darkness. His late-night arrivals were almost ritualistic: exhausted steps, a muted greeting, and a retreat to the sanctuary of sleep, leaving little room for meaningful connection. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, the flickering light from the TV painting faint, restless shadows on the walls, Thomas turned to me with a casual remark that carried a weight he perhaps didn't realize. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone gentle but distracted. His eyes briefly flicked away from the phone in his hand, the screen still glowing with unread emails. I forced a smile, trying to mask the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Just tired," I replied, my voice light, almost dismissive. The words were meant to end the conversation, to deflect attention from the cracks forming between us. Thomas nodded, the reply seemingly satisfying enough for him. Within moments, his focus shifted back to his phone, the soft ping of incoming messages pulling him away. I exhaled quietly, relieved yet hollow, as the unspoken truths hung in the room like invisible weights. As the days passed, the tension in the house grew palpable, lingering like a shadow. It wasn't just the silences that stretched too long or the casual conversations that felt forced. It was something deeper. An ache in the walls, an absence that neither of us dared to name. A few nights later, restless and unable to sleep, I found myself in the kitchen. The stillness of the night wrapped around me as I stood by the counter, pouring a glass of water in the dim light. The coolness of the glass against my palm was grounding, a small anchor amidst the chaos of my thoughts. Then came the soft sound of footsteps, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. I turned instinctively, my pulse quickening as Tyler appeared in the doorway. His hair was disheveled, his expression unreadable, but his presence carried a gravity that filled the room. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, hesitant, like he wasn't sure he should be there. "Something like that," I murmured, my voice almost a whisper. He moved closer, leaning against the counter opposite me. His gaze lingered on mine, unflinching and searching, and the space between us seemed charged with an energy I couldn't explain. It was as if the air had thickened, sharp and fragile. Like the slightest movement could disrupt the delicate balance holding us there. "Same here," he said after a pause, his voice carrying an edge of vulnerability that made my chest tighten. We stood there in silence, the unspoken words between us crowding the room. Every breath felt heavy, laden with the weight of what we both avoided acknowledging. It was Tyler who finally broke the stillness. "About earlier," he began, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. "It was nothing," I interrupted quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. My heart raced as I tried to downplay the significance of what lingered between us. "Was it?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach flip. I wanted to answer, to defuse the moment. But no words came. The silence grew louder, oppressive, and I felt as though I couldn't breathe. Tyler's hand reached out, tentative yet deliberate. His fingers brushed mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me. I froze, my breath catching as if the world had narrowed to just this one fleeting moment. "Maya," he said, his voice a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. "I don't want to make this harder than it already is. But I can't keep pretending nothing's happened." His words hung in the air, raw and exposed, echoing the truth we'd both been avoiding. My mind raced, torn between the gravity of his confession and the consequences it carried. The distance that had always existed between us had vanished, replaced by something visceral, undeniable. And just like that, everything changed. The unspoken words, the fleeting touches, the tension that had simmered for weeks, all of it came crashing down, leaving me breathless and on the precipice of something I couldn't yet define. I swallowed hard, feeling the air grow thick with the weight of his words. Words that seemed to strip away every ounce of pretense I had carefully constructed. It was as though the truth I had been avoiding for so long had suddenly surfaced, raw and undeniable, hovering between us like an unspoken question I wasn't ready to face. "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling against the roar of my racing heartbeat. The words felt foreign, almost as if they didn't belong to me. I don't know what to do with it." The silence stretched between us, heavy and unyielding, as though the universe itself held its breath. His hand remained clasped around mine, warm and steady, grounding me in a moment that felt anything but stable. My thoughts were an uncontrollable whirlwind, guilt, confusion, and a magnetic pull that defied all logic, all reason. I couldn't pull away, even if I wanted to. "I think we need to talk," Tyler finally said, his voice low but firm, the subtle squeeze of his hand reassuring me of one thing, that he wasn't going anywhere. "Talk," I echoed, the syllables catching in my throat like fragile glass threatening to shatter. I nodded, even though the weight of everything unsaid pressed against my chest. Terror churned in my stomach. But alongside it, something else stirred, an unfamiliar spark of hope. Fragile yet persistent. There was something about this moment, this confrontation of everything we had left unspoken, that felt like the cusp of a beginning that scared me as much as it exhilarated me. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, bathing the park in a golden glow that felt almost ethereal. For a brief second, it seemed as though time itself had paused. We stood suspended in that fragile quiet, caught between the choices we'd made and the ones we had yet to make. "Let's go back," I said softly, breaking the silence that had wrapped around us like a cocoon. "We'll figure this out. Somehow." Tyler hesitated for just a heartbeat longer before letting go of my hand. The warmth of his touch lingering on my skin like a ghost. Without another word, we turned and began walking back toward the house. The silence between us was different now, not empty, but charged with the weight of what had passed and the promise of what still lay ahead. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of avoidance and uneasy coexistence. Tyler and I moved around each other like strangers bound by shared walls but not by connection. The kiss lingered in the air between us. An invisible specter we couldn't escape. A memory we both carried but dared not name. I kept telling myself it had been a mistake, a fleeting moment of weakness. A lapse in judgment. Yet the truth clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. The memory of it refused to fade, instead growing sharper with every passing day. If you're still here, watching this story unfold, let me know in the comments. Your thoughts mean more than you know. Every time I saw Tyler, my heart betrayed me, thundering in my chest. A relentless reminder of the line we had crossed. It was a line we should never have approached, let alone stepped over. Guilt gnawed at me like an insatiable hunger. But so did the pull, an ache that felt as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. Ignoring it was like trying to quench a fire by willing it away. The more I tried to suppress it, the brighter it burned, consuming me from within. Thomas, blissfully unaware, remained lost in his work. If he sensed the shift between us, he gave no indication. He was still Thomas, the dependable, hard-working man I had promised my life to. But somewhere along the way, we had begun drifting apart. Two ships pulled by opposing currents, further and further away from each other. The distance between us felt insurmountable. An empty expanse neither of us knew how to bridge. Outwardly, life continued unchanged. I prepared meals, kept the house in order, and smiled when expected. But everything felt hollow, as though I were performing in a play where the lines and gestures no longer carried meaning. The laughter and warmth that had once filled our home seemed like echoes from another life, one that no longer belonged to me. Tyler, too, had withdrawn, retreating into his own world like a wounded animal seeking refuge. He spent hours locked away in his room or disappearing from the house entirely. When he was present, his presence was muted, his words few and carefully chosen. Yet I noticed the cracks in his armor, the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. The quiet softness in his voice when he spoke to me, as if he couldn't quite keep the truth from bleeding through. And so, we danced around the inevitable, each of us caught in the gravity of a moment we couldn't erase, bound by the weight of the choices we had made and the ones still looming ahead. One morning, exactly a week after the kiss that had upended everything, I found myself standing in the kitchen, trying in vain to dispel the heavy ache that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in my chest. The sunlight streaming through the window felt too bright, almost intrusive, as if mocking the darkness swirling inside me. Thomas had already left for work, his absence a silent reminder of the life I was supposed to be living. And Tyler was nowhere in sight. I moved through the motions of making coffee, my hands acting of their own accord, as my mind replayed the kiss in a loop I couldn't escape. The rich aroma of freshly ground beans filled the air, but it brought no comfort. Then, I heard it, a soft creak of the door behind me. My hand stilled mid-motion, and a familiar voice cut through the fragile stillness. "Can we talk?" Tyler's tone was tentative, layered with hesitation and something I couldn't quite place, an almost apologetic quality that made my heart race. I froze. the blood rushing to my ears. Slowly, I turned to face him. There he was, standing in the doorway, his frame leaning heavily against the doorframe as though the weight he carried was too much to bear. The look in his eyes mirrored the turmoil within me, and the tension that had lingered since the kiss seemed to swell, filling the space between us like an invisible wall. I tried to summon the words I had rehearsed countless times, about boundaries, about the lines we could never cross again, but they slipped through my grasp. In their place was only a stark truth: I was exhausted. Exhausted from pretending that kiss hadn't ignited something in me. Exhausted from convincing myself I could ignore the way he made me feel. Yeah, I finally managed. My voice barely audible. More breath than sound. "We can talk." He stepped into the kitchen, shutting the door behind him with a deliberate finality that sent a shiver down my spine. The room, already intimate, seemed to shrink. The walls felt closer, the air heavier. He leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder, as though he couldn't quite bring himself to meet my gaze. The silence stretched taut between us, oppressive and thick, until he finally broke it. "I don't know what to do, Maya," he said, his voice raw and quiet, as if the words had been wrenched from him. "I don't know how to fix this. I can't just forget it." The vulnerability in his voice undid me. My throat tightened, and I swallowed hard before responding. "Neither can I," I admitted, my voice quivering under the weight of my confession. "But that doesn't make it right. Tyler. What happened, it was wrong." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. But there was something in his eyes that caught me off guard. A flicker of desperation. A quiet intensity that made my chest ache. "I don't regret it," he murmured, almost as though speaking to himself. His words a quiet defiance that sliced through me like a blade. A sharp pang of emotion surged within me, part guilt, part yearning. The dichotomy of what I felt and what I knew I should feel threatened to overwhelm me. I wanted to tell him to leave. To say that this had to end. That we couldn't continue down this path. But the words felt hollow, insincere. I knew the truth: they would be lies spoken out of obligation, not conviction. Instead, I found myself searching his face, looking for answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. For the first time, I saw Tyler not as the person he had been, but as the person he was becoming, someone burdened, adrift, reaching for a lifeline. And it struck me with terrifying clarity that he saw me as that anchor. "We can't do this, Tyler," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We have to stop. This isn't fair, to Thomas. To ourselves." His expression darkened, his jaw tightening as if bracing himself against my words. For a moment, I thought he might argue, might insist that we confront whatever was between us. But he didn't. He nodded slowly, the movement almost imperceptible. "I know," he said, his voice low and resigned. The silence that followed was unbearable, suffocating, and yet it carried an air of finality. A resolution we both seemed reluctant to embrace but knew was necessary. "I'll leave you to your coffee," he said finally, his voice strained as he turned toward the door. I just needed to say that. And then he was gone, the sound of the door clicking shut behind him echoing in the stillness. I stood there long after, the weight of our conversation pressing down on me. The air felt charged, as if the tension we had tried to dispel had only grown more potent, more dangerous. I couldn't stop wondering if the hardest part wasn't acknowledging what existed between us, but facing the repercussions of what we had allowed to begin. Had we crossed a line that could never be undone? Or was this the moment where we decided which parts of ourselves we were willing to sacrifice for the sake of the lives we had built? The unspoken questions hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking, refusing to dissipate. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my breath caught in my throat. Tyler's absence was palpable, his proximity still lingering in the air like a phantom touch. Too much, and yet not nearly enough. The chasm between us felt vast and insurmountable, as though the universe itself conspired to keep us apart. And yet, the physical distance was so small, just the space of a single breath, a fleeting glance, the whisper of a touch. My heart betrayed me, thrumming in sync with the unspoken tension between us. The magnetic force that had been pulling me toward him ever since that first electrifying kiss. But I resisted it with everything I had. I had to. Tyler, I whispered, my voice trembling as I shook my head, desperate to dispel the weight of his words, to deny the truth that I knew lingered beneath them. It can't happen. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. And though every fiber of my being screamed for me to step away, I stood rooted to the spot, unable to sever the invisible thread that tied us together. Why not? His voice, tinged with quiet desperation, softened into something raw and pleading. Why can't we stop pretending? Why can't we just face what's right in front of us? Because it's wrong, I replied, forcing my voice into something firm, though it cracked under the weight of uncertainty. Because I'm married. And Thomas deserves better than this. Tyler's face flickered with pain, a fleeting vulnerability that he quickly buried behind a stoic mask. But in that fleeting moment, I saw it, the depth of what he felt for me, the unspoken words he was holding back. Thomas doesn't see you, Maya, he said, his tone measured yet cutting, each word hitting me like a blow. Not the way I do. The truth of his words landed heavier than I wanted to admit. I opened my mouth to deny it, to protest, to declare that he was wrong, that I was whole, unbroken, and didn't need to be seen. But the words refused to come. Instead, I stood there, staring at him, feeling the ache in my chest deepen as the truth clawed its way to the surface. I see you, he continued, his voice breaking, trembling with emotion he could no longer hide. I see all of you, Maya. And I care about you, in a way that terrifies me, in a way I can't control. His confession hung in the charged air between us, heavy with meaning, a challenge I wasn't ready to accept. The weight of it pressed against me, daring me to acknowledge the undeniable pull, to abandon my carefully constructed walls and step into the unknown. But I shook my head, trying to steady myself against the tide threatening to sweep me away. This isn't the answer, Tyler, I said, though the words sounded hollow even to me. This is running away from everything that matters. He exhaled sharply, his eyes searching mine as though looking for the part of me that might still believe in what we could be. Slowly, he reached out, his hand hovering just inches from my arm, a tentative gesture that seemed to ask for permission rather than forgiveness. My breath hitched, and though every rational thought in my head screamed at me to pull away, I stayed frozen in place. His fingers grazed mine, so light it was barely a touch, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore, a spark that reignited the fire I had fought so hard to extinguish. "Please," he whispered. His voice raw. His words a quiet plea that threatened to unravel me completely. "Don't shut me out." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the heat of his touch, the nearness of him, the overwhelming wave of emotion that surged inside me. For one fleeting, impossible moment, I wanted to give in, to surrender to the pull and forget everything else, everything but him. But then I thought of Thomas. I thought of the life we had built together, the vows I had made, the promises I was still bound to keep. I thought of the man who had stood by me, who had believed in me even when I doubted myself. The image of his face, his trust, his love, grounded me in the reality I couldn't escape. When I opened my eyes, I took a step back, creating a chasm between Tyler and me that felt even larger than before. The air grew colder as the warmth of his touch faded, replaced by the sharp edge of resolve. "I can't," I said, my voice barely audible, each word dragging like a weight from my chest. "I can't do this to him, or to myself." Tyler stood still, his hand falling to his side as his expression shifted, dark with frustration and a deeper pain that mirrored my own. He didn't try to argue, didn't reach for me again. Instead, he simply stood there, his eyes locked on mine, as though he were memorizing the moment, knowing it might be the last. "I don't want to hurt you, Maya," he said softly, his voice laced with anguish. "But I can't lie to myself either. I can't pretend this isn't real." I could feel my carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, the emotions I had tried so hard to suppress threatening to overtake me. Tears stung at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "I know," I whispered, the words heavy with understanding, with shared pain. "I know, Tyler." The silence that followed was suffocating, stretching endlessly between us as we stood there, both unwilling to move yet knowing we couldn't stay. The air felt charged with everything unsaid, every truth we were too afraid to face. Finally, Tyler broke the stillness, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll leave you alone," he said, though the words carried no conviction. "But it's not over. I can't just forget this. Forget us." I nodded, my heart splintering with each beat. "I know," I said again, this time more resolutely. "But we have to try." And with that, the distance between us grew, not just in steps but in the unbearable weight of all that had passed between us, all that could never be. He turned away, his silhouette disappearing through the doorway. And as the sound of his footsteps faded, the emptiness he left behind seemed to consume me. It wasn't just the quiet, it was the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing in from all sides. The space he left behind was more than physical, it was a chasm that seemed to open beneath me, threatening to swallow me whole. Alone again, I found no solace. The storm within me churned on, relentless, a tempest I couldn't outrun or suppress. Every breath felt heavy, laden with the weight of choices I wasn't ready to face. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the thought crossed my mind, was it too late to turn back? Could I still undo this tangled mess? Or had I already gone too far? The days that followed the barbecue stretched into a haze of oppressive stillness. Even the house seemed to sense the tension, its walls bearing silent witness, as if holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. I went through the motions of daily life, clinging to the pretense of normalcy for Thomas's sake. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, and I could feel them widening with every passing hour. Tyler avoided me like the air between us was toxic. He moved through the house like a shadow, his presence barely tangible. When our paths did cross, the silence between us was suffocating, charged with unspoken words and a shared guilt neither of us could bear to acknowledge. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed consumed by work, but his frequent glances in my direction betrayed his distraction. His eyes lingered longer than usual, sharper, more probing, as if he could sense the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. And I, burdened by the secrets I carried, found myself unraveling under his gaze. One evening, during dinner, I felt his eyes on me. The food on my plate blurred as I forced myself to chew, to swallow, to breathe. When I finally met his gaze, his expression was unreadable, an unsettling mix of curiosity and something darker. Something searching. My stomach twisted. Could he see through me? Could he sense the growing distance I had tried so hard to hide? The dread that had taken root weeks ago now blossomed into full-blown panic, wrapping itself around my chest like a vice. I was teetering on the edge of a precipice, knowing that one wrong step would send everything crashing down. Yet I couldn't bring myself to speak, to shatter the fragile facade that still held us together. Confession felt impossible. The mere thought of it filled me with a paralyzing fear. How could I look Thomas in the eye and admit what I had done? How could I face the hurt in his expression? The disappointment? The betrayal? Worse still was the fear of disbelief, that he wouldn't understand how things had spiraled so far out of control. That he might see me as a stranger, someone unrecognizable. So I buried it all deeper, hoping that somehow, by avoiding it, I could make it disappear. One afternoon, desperate for escape, I went to the library. I told myself I was searching for clarity, for some elusive piece of wisdom that might untangle the chaos in my mind. But even surrounded by the quiet hum of books and strangers, I couldn't escape my thoughts. They circled endlessly, dragging me back to that night, the kiss, Tyler's words, the raw intensity in his eyes. Guilt clawed at me, but beneath it, something else stirred, a longing I couldn't suppress, a desire that terrified me in its persistence. As I walked back to the house, the world felt eerily subdued. The street was emptier than usual, the air heavy, as though everything around me was bracing for the storm I had been avoiding. Part of me wished for it to come, to sweep me up and force the truth into the open. Because I couldn't keep living like this, caught between two worlds, neither of which felt real anymore. When I opened the front door, the sight of Thomas standing in the hallway stopped me cold. There was something about his posture, the way his shoulders squared, the way his eyes searched mine, that sent a chill through me. "Maya," he said, his voice quiet but weighted. "We need to talk." My heart stuttered, then raced, a drumbeat of panic. My first instinct was to run, to retreat before the conversation could begin. But there was no escaping this. I could feel the moment bearing down on me like a freight train. Unstoppable. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to piece together the cracks in our carefully constructed life. About what? I managed. My voice strained, trembling. I tried to sound steady, casual even. But the effort was futile. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. Thomas's jaw tightened. And for a moment, His mask slipped. Anger. Hurt. And something else, something more primal, flashed across his face. About what's been going on with you and Tyler. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My mind raced, grasping for an escape. A denial. Anything to deflect the truth. You're imagining things. I blurted. Too quickly. Too desperately. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were hollow. He wouldn't believe me. Am I? His voice rose. Not in a shout, but with a sharpness that cut through my defenses. Because I don't think I am. Maya. Something's changed. You've changed. And I'm tired of pretending I don't see it. I opened my mouth. But no words came. My throat constricted. The weight of my secret pressing down with suffocating force. The truth was there. Just beneath the surface. Tangled and messy. But now it was choking me. I had carried it for so long, thinking I could control it. But it was slipping through my fingers. I'm sorry. I whispered. The words barely audible. They felt like the first crack in a dam about to burst. I never meant for this to happen. And with those words, the ground beneath me began to crumble. Thomas's expression faltered. And for a moment, I saw the raw vulnerability etched into his features. His shoulders sagged. A physical reflection of the blow my words had dealt him. And the strength I'd always admired in him seemed to waver. It was as though I'd drawn the energy right out of him with the mere act of my silence. What happened? He asked. His voice barely more than a whisper. So fragile it felt like it might shatter in the air between us. I wanted to answer. I wanted to tell him everything, the kiss. The confusion that had taken root in my chest like a storm. And the inexplicable part of me that had begun to crave Tyler in ways I knew I shouldn't. The words burned on the tip of my tongue, begging to be set free. But I swallowed them back, choking on the weight of my guilt. The shame was too overwhelming. The consequences too terrifying. I couldn't bear the thought of watching Thomas's trust crumble. Of seeing the love in his eyes replaced with something colder. Harder. So I stood there, paralyzed. My mind a tumultuous swirl of regret, fear, and something even darker, something I didn't dare examine too closely. Deep down, I understood the bitter truth. No matter what I did or didn't say, nothing would ever be the same again. Secrets, once given air, have a way of dismantling everything. And the truth was an unrelenting force, capable of tearing apart the fragile facade of the life I had so carefully constructed. The tension between us was suffocating. A chasm of unspoken words that seemed to grow wider with every passing second. My heart pounded in my chest. Every beat a cruel reminder of how precariously balanced my world had become. I wanted to believe in us, Thomas said at last, his tone heavy with despair. But now, I don't even know what we are anymore. His words hit like a punch. And I could feel the tears welling up, threatening to betray the turmoil inside me. I opened my mouth to respond. But no sound came. My voice, the one thing I'd always relied on, failed me in this moment of truth. Far away, the sound of waves lapping against the shore echoed faintly. A cruel contrast to the storm raging in my heart. It was Tyler's voice that cut through the chaos. Low and steady, pulling me back to the moment we'd shared, a moment I couldn't erase. No matter how desperately I wished to. It wasn't just a kiss. Maya. Tyler had said. His voice thick with an emotion I didn't want to name. It was more than that. You felt it too. I had turned away from him then, my breath hitching as I struggled to regain my composure. I hadn't wanted to meet his eyes, because I knew what I'd see there, the same pull that threatened to unravel me. The same fire I was fighting so hard to extinguish. Tyler. This is wrong. I'd whispered, my voice trembling despite the conviction I tried to summon. We can't do this. It's not fair to anyone. But Tyler had only looked at me, his gaze steady and unyielding. Pretending it doesn't exist won't make it go away, he'd said. His words a knife that cut through the defenses I'd built around my heart. It's real. And you know it. And now, as I stood before Thomas, the weight of that truth pressed down on me like a boulder. My heart was a battlefield, torn between loyalty and longing, between the life I had and the one I might have wanted. If only I'd had the courage to admit it. Thomas's eyes searched mine, desperate for answers I couldn't give. His pain was palpable, a mirror of my own. And yet I couldn't bridge the gap between us. The silence stretched on, oppressive and unyielding, until it felt like it might suffocate us both. I don't know what to say, I finally whispered, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. Thomas let out a bitter laugh, his shoulders shaking with the force of it. Maybe there's nothing left to say, he replied, his voice laced with a resignation that broke something inside me. As I watched him walk away, the reality of what I'd done hit me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about Tyler, or even about the kiss. It was about the choices I'd made, the secrets I'd kept, and the fragile threads of trust that had been stretched too thin to hold. By the time I made it home, I felt hollow, as though the weight of my guilt had hollowed me out from the inside. I wasn't sure if I had the strength to face Thomas, or if I even deserved the chance to try. But one thing was clear, the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. And when it did, it would leave nothing untouched. You don't know, he repeated, his voice frayed with an emotion that sliced through the air like a cold wind. The words landed with a weight that made my chest tighten, each syllable a reckoning, forcing me to confront the things I had refused to see. I don't know anymore, Thomas, I admitted, the confession escaping before I could stop it. Raw and unfiltered. I don't know what I feel. I don't know what I want. His expression shifted, the firmness of his jaw softening as a profound sadness swept across his face. It was the kind of sadness I had been avoiding for months. The kind that spoke of a love stretched too thin, fraying at the edges. In that moment, I knew that whatever wall I had built to shield us from this truth had finally crumbled, leaving only the stark reality of our brokenness. He could see me now, the hollowed-out version of who I used to be. Is it him? Thomas's voice was quieter now, almost fragile, as if speaking the words out loud would make them real. Tyler. I hesitated. My mouth opened, but no sound came. How could I tell him? How could I explain the moments with Tyler, the kiss that lingered like an unanswered question? The way he made everything else seem distant, almost irrelevant. It wasn't just a single act, it was the weight of knowing that the life I had built with Thomas, the love we once shared, now felt like a shadow of itself. My heart had drifted, not because I wanted it to, but because somewhere along the way, I had stopped feeling at home in my own life. I don't know, I whispered, the words trembling with guilt. Each syllable felt like a betrayal. I don't know how it got to this point. Thomas took a step back. The movement slight but powerful. As if distancing himself physically would somehow ease the pain. His hand fell limply to his side. A gesture so final that it pierced through me. The space between us grew heavier. Colder. Like an invisible barrier neither of us dared to cross. "Is it too late for us?" he asked. His voice barely audible. Almost as if he feared the answer. I wanted to scream no. I wanted to reach for him. To tell him we could find a way back. That love like ours couldn't just vanish. But the words stayed lodged in my throat. Unspoken. I couldn't lie to him, not now. Not after everything. All I could do was look at him. My silence speaking the truths I was too afraid to voice. "I'm sorry, Thomas," I said at last. My voice barely more than a whisper. The apology felt empty. Like throwing a pebble into an endless abyss. I knew it wouldn't be enough to mend the wounds I had inflicted. Thomas didn't respond. He just stood there. His features etched with disbelief and grief. As if the weight of my words was too much to bear. Finally, without another word, he turned and walked away. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed in the silence. Each step a painful reminder that this was the moment everything changed. This was the moment we couldn't come back from. I sank into a chair. My body folding in on itself as the reality of it all crashed over me. My hands trembled. My breath came in shallow bursts. And my thoughts spiraled into chaos. The life I had known, my marriage, my future, had unraveled in a matter of moments. The silence that filled the house now was suffocating. But it was the silence within me that hurt the most. I wasn't just losing Thomas. I was losing myself. The hours passed like a slow drip. Each one stretching the chasm between us wider. Thomas stayed in the kitchen. The muffled sounds of cabinets opening and closing the only indication of his presence. I sat frozen in the living room. Staring at the floor. Unable to bridge the gap between us. When he finally emerged. His footsteps were deliberate. But his posture betrayed a weariness I had never seen in him before. He stopped at the doorway. His eyes flickering to mine for the briefest moment before darting away. As if even looking at me was too much. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was steady but distant. Carrying an undertone of something deeper, resignation. Perhaps. Or a sorrow that words couldn't fully capture. I nodded. My throat tightening. This was it. The conversation I had dreaded. The one I knew would either bind us together or sever us completely. "Thomas," I began. My voice faltering under the weight of everything I wanted to say. "I'm sorry. I know I've hurt you. And I paused. Searching for the right words. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied me. His gaze searching for something, answers. Maybe. Or some hint of the woman he used to know. Finally, he spoke. His words deliberate and measured. "Do you even know what you want?" he asked. The question hung in the air between us. Heavy with implication. Tears welled in my eyes. But I blinked them back. Unwilling to let them fall. "I don't know," I admitted. My voice breaking. "I thought I did. But now, I don't know who I am anymore." Thomas's shoulders slumped. And for the first time, I saw the toll this had taken on him. The love in his eyes wasn't gone. but it was buried beneath layers of hurt and disappointment. He didn't press me further. Instead, he turned away. His silence saying more than words ever could. And in that silence, I realized the full weight of my choices, not just what I had lost, but what I had taken from him. From us. The life we had built was gone. And all that remained were the jagged pieces we were too broken to put back together. The moment his words cut through the room, it felt like the earth shifted beneath my feet. I don't know who you are anymore, Elise, Thomas said. His voice sharp and precise. As if he had rehearsed this confrontation 1,000 times in his mind. You've been distant for so long. I didn't want to see it. But now I can't ignore it. You're not the person I married. Each syllable landed like a blow. I had braced myself for anger. For accusations. For pain. But this, a declaration so definitive. So void of hope, pierced deeper than I had imagined. It wasn't just the words, it was the unspoken truth behind them. The realization that he had given up on me long before he had the courage to say it. I'm sorry. I whispered. My voice trembling as tears blurred my vision. I've lost myself too. Thomas. I don't even know who I am anymore. Let alone what I want. But I know I've hurt you. And I hate myself for it. He stood there. Silent for a moment. His arms crossed in a way that felt both defensive and defeated. His gaze softened briefly. As if a part of him wanted to comfort me. But then it hardened again. So what now? He asked. His tone steady. Though the tremor beneath it betrayed the vulnerability he was trying to suppress. What happens to us? Elise? Is there any part of you that still wants to fight for this? Or is this the end? I wanted to say yes. To cling to the life we had built together. To the memories. The laughter. The love that once felt so unshakable. But I couldn't lie to him, not anymore. Not after everything that had unraveled between us. I don't know. I said. My voice barely audible. As the weight of my confession settled over both of us. I don't know. The silence that followed was excruciating. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was the echo of everything we had lost. Thomas's expression became unreadable. A mask of detachment as he absorbed the gravity of my words. When he finally turned away, it felt as if an invisible thread between us had snapped. I think I need some space, he said quietly. His voice almost drowned by the stillness of the house. And then he was gone. Leaving me standing there. Paralyzed by the enormity of what had just happened. For a long time. I didn't move. The silence enveloped me. Suffocating and absolute. I had seen this moment coming, felt it creeping closer with every distant glance. Every unspoken word, but knowing it was inevitable didn't make it any less devastating. The weight of the broken promises. The shattered trust. And the haunting uncertainty of what lay ahead was overwhelming. I sat down. Staring at the empty space he had left behind. The woman I had been, the wife. The partner. The version of myself who believed in forever, was gone. The kiss with Tyler. The lies. The slow unraveling of everything I once held dear, they had all led me here. And I wasn't sure I would ever find my way back. The days following the divorce were a haze of monotony and grief. I clung to routines, work, errands. The quiet solace of solitude, but everything felt hollow. The house, once alive with the rhythm of our shared life, now seemed like a mausoleum. Thomas's absence was a palpable presence. A shadow that lingered in every room. And Tyler. Tyler had left a void I didn't know how to fill. Nights were the hardest. I would sit in the living room, surrounded by fragments of our past, photo albums, mementos, echoes of laughter that felt like they belonged to someone else. One evening, I found myself flipping through our wedding photos. There we were, radiant and full of hope, laughing at a joke only we seemed to understand. Those smiles had been real, or at least they had felt real. But now, they seemed like ghosts, taunting me with memories of a life I had let slip through my fingers. One afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table, the sound of a knock at the door startled me. I hadn't been expecting anyone. When I opened it, there was no one there. Only a plain brown package on the doorstep. Curious, I brought it inside and opened it to find a small framed photo of Thomas and me from our honeymoon. Beneath it was a simple note in Tyler's familiar handwriting: "I'm sorry for everything. Tyler." My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the note. The photo was a bittersweet reminder of what had once been. Of the moments when everything had felt possible. Running my fingers over the frame, I was struck by the cruel irony of it all, how I had tried so desperately to hold on to everything, only to end up with nothing. The weeks that followed were a blur of numbness and raw emotion. Some days, I felt like I was making progress, going through the motions of life and convincing myself that I could rebuild. But other days, the weight of it all, the divorce, the choices that had led me here, the absence of everything I had taken for granted, would crash over me like a tidal wave, leaving me gasping for air. Each night, as the house grew quiet, I would sit alone with my thoughts, haunted by the same questions. Could I have done things differently? Was there ever a version of this story where we all found happiness? And most painfully, who was I now? In the aftermath of it all, the answers didn't come easily, if they came at all. But in those quiet moments, I began to understand that the path forward wasn't about finding the person I used to be, it was about learning to live with the person I had become. I stood before the mirror one morning, frozen, staring at the reflection that seemed so foreign. It wasn't just the face staring back at me, it was the weight in my eyes, the lines etched by sleepless nights, and the shadows of choices I could no longer take back. I traced my fingers lightly across the edges of the glass, as though touching it might bring clarity, might somehow bridge the gap between the woman I used to be and the stranger I had become. The words escaped my lips, barely a whisper, yet heavy with meaning. I don't know who I am anymore. That moment stayed with me, lingering in the quiet corners of my mind, like an uninvited guest. It wasn't until months later, after countless nights of restless introspection, that I allowed myself to begin piecing together a life that had shattered. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but in small, almost imperceptible ways, I started to move forward. I signed up for evening classes, art history, a long-forgotten passion buried beneath years of responsibilities. I took walks around my neighborhood, the crunch of leaves underfoot grounding me in ways I hadn't expected. With each step, I began to redefine who I was, not as someone's wife, not as a woman torn between two impossible loves, but simply as Elise, alone, raw, and starting anew. It wasn't easy. Healing never is. There were days when the silence of my own thoughts was deafening. Days when I longed to slip back into the comfort of the past, even with all its imperfections. But somewhere along those winding paths and within the pages of the books I studied, I found flickers of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that swept in and made everything better. But it was enough to keep going. Tyler remained a ghost of the past, silent, distant, yet ever present in my memories. I hadn't heard from him since the day he walked away. His absence as loud as the words we never spoke. I often wondered if our paths would cross again. Would time soften the sharp edges of our shared history? Or were we destined to remain fragments of each other's unfinished stories? For now, I could only live with the version of myself I was slowly learning to accept. Some things, I realized, are simply not meant to last. And perhaps that's the hardest truth of all. The letter arrived unexpectedly, its weight disproportionate to the single sheet of paper inside. I let it sit on my kitchen table for days. Its presence both a comfort and a challenge. Tyler's words, scrawled in his unmistakable hand, weren't just an apology, they were an acknowledgement. A testament to the love we had shared and the lives we had changed. It was his goodbye. But more than that, it was a release. It was the closure I hadn't realized I was yearning for. For the first time in what felt like years, I breathed deeply and felt something shift. A soft, steady peace settled in my chest. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about recognizing that some chapters are meant to end so new ones can begin. Tyler had found his path. And though it no longer intersected with mine, it was enough to know he was at peace. Now, it was my turn. My new apartment was small and unremarkable. But it was mine. The bare walls and second-hand furniture whispered of beginnings, not endings. I spent my days exploring the nearby park, discovering hidden coffee shops that felt like sanctuaries, and writing reflections on the woman I was becoming. Each small step felt like an act of rebellion against the grief that had once consumed me. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't just about others, it was about me. The weight of guilt and regret was heavy. But carrying it forever wasn't an option. I couldn't change the choices I had made or the hearts I had hurt. But I could decide how to move forward. Slowly, I began to let go, finding joy in the small victories and meaning in the overlooked details of everyday life. Thomas's face still lingered in my thoughts. His voice a quiet echo. I wondered if he would ever forgive me. But I knew now that his forgiveness wasn't mine to demand. What mattered most was how I chose to forgive myself. One evening, while wandering the city, I stumbled upon a bookstore I hadn't seen before. Its windows were lined with books, their titles beckoning with quiet promise. I stepped inside, the scent of old paper and fresh coffee wrapping around me like a warm embrace, running my fingers along the spines. I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a spark of quiet joy. A reminder that life, messy and unpredictable, could still hold beauty. Perhaps life isn't about perfect endings or flawless answers. Perhaps it's about embracing the chaos, the mistakes, and the unexpected turns. It's about writing your story, one imperfect page at a time. And mine, while far from complete, was beginning to take shape. Lessons from a fragile moment, moving forward after life's unexpected turns. Life is a journey filled with choices, some of which test our morals, relationships, and sense of self. Through this story, we're reminded that even the smallest moments can carry profound consequences. It's a powerful lesson about the importance of boundaries, the courage to face our feelings, and the strength to make choices that align with our values. Let this serve as a reminder to cherish the relationships that matter. Communicate openly with loved ones, And embrace the imperfections of life as opportunities to grow and move forward. No matter how challenging life gets, there is always a path to healing and self-discovery if we are willing to take it. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Your support inspires us to share more compelling stories like this. Thank you for being part of this journey. And we'll see you in the next video.